So it's 6:59. Oh. Jason, you just
Bells
heard
are ringing.
we're live now, right?
Correct. So silly question. How do we know? Can we see who's here?
Yeah, there's a participants.
Participants down there.
Okay. And y'all could see the PowerPoint?
Mhm.
Yep.
Because I can't. Am I moving that PowerPoint right now?
Yeah, you are.
Yes.
All right. Well, welcome, folks. I hope everyone is, we were excited for everyone to be joining us this evening. Having a little bit of technical difficulties, so if things go slightly awry, they're probably my fault. So I'm the least technologically capable in this office by far. So, but we'll, no, I don't know. I'm pretty sure it. Anna and Cheryl by far the strongest of the four of us. So we're going to wait another minute to get started, but glad you're here. And for those of you who joined us at Parents Weekend, some of this may be repetitive, but hopefully some of it will be also new as well. And we're also going to have time to answer questions. So looking forward to that. I can't see the participant list, so we look like we have a decent number of folks here.
Yeah, we have about 39 attendees.
Great. Well, all right. Well, why don't we get started then? Welcome, everyone. For those of you we haven't met, although we probably met most of you by now, I'm Jason Hansel. I'll let my colleagues go around and introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Anna Hastings. Great to see everyone, at least on a list.
Hi, I'm Martha Pitts.
I am Cheryl Rojas.
Jason, you're muted.
There we go. Again, we are excited that you are here with us this evening, and we're going to give you a brief overview of what we've been working on with the students with the class of 24. Show you highlights of our program, our database that's called SCOIR, which is spelled SCOIR. The kids like to call it Squire, but it's actually pronounced SCOIR. And we're going to show you how we use that as a tool to help students build lists. And then we will finish up with just kind of a quick overview of all the things we'll be working on throughout the rest of the year and have time for some questions. We do have a pretty hard stop at around 7:45, but I think we'll get a lot of information in, hopefully get your questions answered. So I'm going to turn it over to Martha to get us started, and we'll go from there.
Okay, it disappeared. All right, timeline for the fifth form year. So your students have seen this timeline many times already. And I think we briefly went over it at the meeting during Parents Weekend. So early September, we met with the whole fifth form to talk about college counseling, expectations, important dates. So the first important date happened in mid-September. We offered the practice ACT. About 34 juniors took advantage of this opportunity. The PACTs were held in October, and most of the fifth form class took the PSATs, and I believe results we'll have the results of those scores post Thanksgiving break. Recently, we were assigned our counselees, so your kids were assigned, each of us, Ms. Hastings, Mr. Hansel, and myself. We've already sent out their college questionnaire, which is essentially getting to know you, getting to know me kind of deal. So we asked really interesting questions about, their favorite class at SAS, people they admire, some of their favorite traditions, if they could learn, what was that question? If they could learn a skill I think in an hour. If they could wake up tomorrow and one skill you already have will be expert level, what skill is that? Why would you want to be an expert? So the responses to this questionnaire is about 20 plus questions. It's just to give us, an idea of kind of what makes your child tick. What are they interested in? What are their passions? And this is what we talk about in our first college meeting. So we don't talk about colleges, we talk about them and their interest. In order to better prepare, for their future. So we actually begin those meetings if they've already completed a college questionnaire, November, December. Some students have already completed the questionnaire and have met with us. And then the next meeting we have occurs in January, where we start to build a college list.
For some reason, this won't let me click to the next slide.
If you click, are you there on it?
Hold on. Go to it. I'm on it.
Try the arrow.
I'm hitting that right arrow, but it's not moving it.
There we
There
go.
we go.
Hi. So I'm going to continue kind of talking about the junior year a bit, sort of the latter half of it. As you could see from the previous slide, our second meeting with students takes place in January. And at that point in time, we start to kind of get into the nitty gritty of what they might be looking for in a college. And that helps us begin to build that initial college list. We like to wait until that point because we are very close to, if not at the end of the first semester. So we have a sense of how they have performed in the first half of their junior year. We typically have their first set of test scores because we recommend that most students test in, by December, either the SAT or the ACT. And also we tend to find that kind of starting that process of list building a little bit later usually is a little bit better because students grow up a little bit more and have a little bit of a better sense of what they might be seeking. So that list building process begins in January and February in earnest. And meetings tend to revolve around kind of the research that students are doing. Perhaps by the time we hit spring break in March, any visits that they may have done over that vacation. Students also will often frequently do test prep in kind of the winter and early spring of the fifth form year in anticipation of either an April ACT or a May SAT. Some students will take the SAT in March. It happens over spring break, so if they do that, then they're taking that at home, whereas with April and May tests, they can do them here on campus. In the spring, sort of post-spring break, we work on kind of really deliberately helping students pick their classes for their senior year, potentially still talking about college visits, obviously always talking about kind of the list of schools and what they're learning and how they're learning that information to figure out which places are best for them. And then in May, we begin talking with students about recommendations, which teachers from their junior year might be the ones that write for them, write references for them for their schools. Just so you know, we recommend that students have 2 letters of recommendation from teachers within the junior year. Pretty firmly recommend that one is from a teacher in the humanities, English or history, or perhaps religious studies, who can comment on how they write. And then the other one comes often from a quantitative teacher, math or science, but sometimes if the student is particularly humanities oriented or maybe is really strong in a language other than English, that they choose one of those subjects instead. We also write a letter of recommendation, of course, as their counselor in the fall. In May, we do a college essay workshop with students. We also help them create their Common Application account so that they have that ready to go over the summer and can kind of finish filling it out over the summer. And over the course of the summer after their junior year, certainly many students do some visits then to try to narrow their list down. They begin their college application work, both continuing to fill out the Common App, which is a bit of a bear, and then also writing the infamous college essay.
Okay. So we're going to shift gears and talk a little bit about the program that students already have access to, and you will be receiving access to very shortly. And it's called SCORE. And we want to describe a little bit of what it is and how we use it. So essentially, it becomes sort of our database and our tracker on helping kids apply to colleges and build college lists. And we use this data to help guide students in choosing appropriate colleges based on selectivity throughout this spring and into the fall. So when you receive your invite, this is the front page, and you'll have access to this. So this would be a typical list that we would see in SCORE for a student. And so we built this list based off a student that we created to give you a sense of what a list might look like in SCORE. So we have 10 colleges. Thematically, these colleges are all sort of medium-sized universities, kind of between North Carolina and New England up in Boston. And we sort of, the student we created here is from Maryland. So one thing we recommend all students do is apply to their home state university. We just think it's there's a lot of great state universities, and we think our students have a lot of success getting into those state universities. And so we usually recommend that they apply to their home state university just to have as an option. So for this student that we created, they have University of Maryland. And we often talk about, as we create lists with students, and again, a lot of you probably have heard before, but that the list is balanced. And what we mean by that is, if you see on the far right side, it's the likelihood of acceptance. And you can see with 2 that we call likely, there are 2 that we call at the bottom, we call reaches. And then of course, in the middle is the, 6 schools that we consider possible. And these are broad categories, so you could put in, sometimes we put a number or a percentage on these, but in general, I like to say if it's likely, the student's chance of admission are very high, probably greater than 80 or 90% in terms of likelihood of acceptance. And then the possible range can be much wider. It could be a high possible. We'd call that something in the 50 to 75% range. A lower possible would be something in the 25% to 50% range. And so those are subtleties and nuances that we'll talk through with students, and we'll show you in a second some of the data that sort of supports some of that information. And then the reach schools, we have a rule here in our office, is that any school that admits less than 10% of their applicants, it's automatically a reach. So you can see Vanderbilt's acceptance rate there at 7.1%. That's obviously going to be a reach for every student, regardless of their academic backgrounds and their testing. So again, all this information will be in SCORE as we help them build lists. They can see what the average SAT score of an acceptance student is, what the average ACT acceptance rate overall. But then we also have a lot of much more specific information to St. Andrews. So go ahead, Anna, you go.
I was going to say, so we have one other aspect of SCORE that exists is access to these, they call them scattergrams or scatter plots, which this is part of how we work with students and work with you to help determine which schools fall into these categories that Jason has just described. So you can see, if you're looking at this on the vertical axes, you have testing. On the horizontal axes, you have GPA. And this particular fake student or created student has a GPA at 92 and an SAT score around 1380, which is sort of between a 30 and a 31 on the ACT. And so they are the purple star. And if you look at this scatter plot, you'll see where that star is located. Any circle that is green is a student who has been admitted to the school. Any circle that is blue is a student that has been waitlisted when they've applied to the school. And then a circle that is yellow, and then you can kind of see a faint green rim on it, is a student that was deferred. So that means that they applied in the early round and they were told, we're going to wait until the regular decision round to see if you're admissible. If they have a yellow with a green, that means that they were admitted later. So you can see that this purple star student is in amongst quite a bit of green here in this applicant pool at Elon. which is
And
part of-
just for clarification, these are only St. Andrews applicants. So these are strictly students from St. Andrews in the last 4 years. And while the student with the star we made up, but those are all real St. Andrews students. So you get a sense of GPA, SAT, ACT score for students who've applied to Elon in the last 4 years.
There's a question, it might be good since the slide is up, about the data that goes into SCORE to produce the list.
Great. Can you see it, Martha, and read it?
Yeah, so what is the data that goes into SCORE to produce that list?
Yeah, so that is data from St. Andrews students based on their GPA at the end of the junior year. So these are GPAs that are calculated at the end of the junior year, and then based on testing information we have on the student. Now, what's made it a little tricky in recent years is as we've talked about in past conversations, students can apply test optional. And so sometimes you'll see a student who got in with maybe much lower testing, and in all likelihood, that is a student that is test optional, who applied test optional. So
if we look at this chart for the University of Maryland, and someone just asked the question about if the red triangle indicates a student who has been denied, and the answer to that question is yes. So now we're looking at another scatter plot of a different school. We've called the University of Maryland a possible for this student. Now you might say, gosh, there's an awful lot of green around this purple star. Yes, and we think that the student this is probably a pretty strong possible for this student, but you can also see that red triangle up at that 93 GPA and 35 ACT mark didn't get in. And so this is where it's great for all of you to have some of this data and for your students to have this data, but coming in and talking to us about it is where we can tell them, for example, that particular student applied to one of Maryland's more competitive programs. And they also, and this is a little bit of getting into the nitty gritty, they applied regular decision, which at Maryland is much more competitive because they've already filled a lot of seats because they are a big state school. And so many students who apply there, especially if they want to apply to engineering or business, need to apply in that first round of applications. And I should just be clear, at Maryland, that's not the binding early decision, that's early action. But so there's nothing binding a student, but there is a notable difference, even as recently as last year, to the outcomes for early action versus regular decision there. And again, especially if the student is a kind of a STEM focused student, because Maryland kind of nationally is known for that.
again, as Anna mentioned, you'll have access to some of this information, but what's important is there's a lot of subtlety and nuance and context, and that's where we can share those stories and explain some of the outliers in some cases for some of these decisions. So Wake Forest, and now you start to see again the difference between what that likely looked like, where the applicant was mostly in with all students from St. Andrews that got accepted. Maryland also looked very good, despite we saw that one outlier who applied to a very selective program and applied late. So Wake Forest, what's nice about the Wake Forest graph in some ways, there is some clarity, right? So if you're down and to the left more, there tends to be more red triangles. If you're up way and to the right, there's a cluster of admits up there. And when you're in the middle ground there, you see a mix of both accepted students and waitlisted students. So you see a real a variety in that mid-range, students sort of between 91 and 93, with testing sort of in that. And again, Wake Forest has been a school that's been test optional for many years. So we know that test optional is certainly a viable option for students who are interested in Wake Forest. But again, this is where some of the subtleties and nuances stand out. Is Wake Forest is a school that does have early decision, and it's a place where the early decision applicant is going to be an advantaged applicant. And that's what we find in that middle category there, is that a lot of those students who were green, who got accepted, were early decision applicants. So, but again, I think this is a student who kind of falls in the right range. And if this student said to us that Wake Forest was their first choice, we might say, hey, based on what we've seen in recent history, this might be a school to think about for early decision. And we know in regular decision, it gets much tougher, and that the odds go down quite a bit for a school like Wake. So maybe a possible overall, maybe a slightly strong possible and early, but maybe more of a slight high or lower possibility, or even maybe a slight reach in regular decision. So that's kind of Wake is one of those schools where early decision really does impact the college's decisions.
We've had two questions about the data here. And yes, parents do have access to graphs like this in SCORE. How many years data is available? I believe for parents, and Jason or Martha or Cheryl, correct me if I'm wrong. For parents and students, I think it only goes back 4 or 5 years, but we actually have access to data from 20 years ago in it. But quite frankly, it's the last 4 or 5 years that's the most valuable because it's the most recent, and things change. And if you were at Parents Weekend, you might have remembered me saying 20 years ago, the admit rate at Vanderbilt was close to 50%, and now it's around 7 or 8. So 20 years ago, data actually wouldn't necessarily help us a whole lot. It's really the last 5 years that's the most valuable.
The one caveat to the data is we do, if there's a college, let's throw an example out there, Carleton College, which is a great small liberal arts college in Minnesota and literally, considered one of the best. We just don't have enough applicants to merit sort of being able to share the data. So when we only have a couple of applicants, we generally won't share that data with families just because of confidentiality issues. Obviously, when we have lots of data at a place like Vanderbilt over the last 4 years, we're happy to share that information with you. So yeah, and generally we do base it on the last 4 years because that's the most relevant and accurate. So, but again, we saw the contrast between the Elon and even the middle ground, Maryland and Wake, and to see a place like Vanderbilt, you see how much more selective a school that only admits 7% becomes. And so you see a mostly large cluster of red triangles here on our left. And then some admits up there on the right side, but you see the much stronger testing in most cases and GPA for that cluster of admits. You may also see those anchors there, those little anchors on some of the both, there's one on a wait list, there's a couple on students who were denied, and of course there's some on an admitted student. And generally that means that the student had some sort of tie to the university. It's a legacy tie is often what that means. Sometimes if it's a recruited athlete, we'll put that in there as well. I don't know if you guys want to add to that.
No, it's just, you can see at a place like Vanderbilt, some of those hooks, as we might call them, perhaps play less of a role because it's so selective than at perhaps a place that has a slightly less or a slightly higher admit rate.
Yeah, and then again, the general rule when schools admit less than 10%, as you can see, they become much less predictable. We can make lots of predictions based on our data and recent history and students we know, and that's really helpful. But when we get to the schools of less than 10%, we can say, hey, if you're in this right cluster, we can see where these students, you're in the right range of students who get admitted. But then even that it's not an automatic, as you can see, as you get into that higher range there. So.
Yeah, I think that speaks to a question. When you factor in test optional, does the GPA become more predictive?
Great question.
Yeah.
We've only had these last 2 years of test optional data, and a decent chunk of our kids still submitted test scores, but yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that there might be a little bit more emphasis on that GPA at those schools that do offer test optional that are highly selective, but it's not a massive difference, but maybe a subtle difference in that area. But that's something I think as we collect data this year, we'll try to take a look and see if we notice any strong correlation there. But I suspect it will a little bit. So, obviously you guys, you're all going to get access to this very soon. I know some parents get so excited about this data and we'll spend hours on that. Other parents aren't as enamored by it, but it's there as a tool. And then we certainly welcome you to reach out if you have questions. You've asked some great questions tonight. We certainly, and we look at these graphs these scattergrams with the students too. So we walk through them with the students. we plot that where they would be on the graph and sort of show them where they fall. And again, it's how we really help refine the list. We don't necessarily start the list with looking at the graphs because we really want to, start with a broad net and put lots of schools on their list. And then as we move forward, that's when we'll sort of really get into the data and the graphs and show, what looks like a likely versus a possible, what's a reach. The other thing to keep in mind too is that, a lot will depend on this year. We don't know, for some students, depending on their test scores, if they decide to have test scores, and then also how their junior year, plays out in terms of their grades and their and what their overall GPA will be at the end of the year. And just as a reminder, if you were panicked about the quarter grades, those they are not on the transcript. Only the semester grades go on the transcript. So those are the ones factored into the GPA. So right now they just have a progress report, and the semester grade that comes out in January will be the one that goes on the transcript and calculate it into the GPA. So, well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about testing, and we'll take some more questions in after this.
Yeah, so a few notes about testing and then some dates below that. So most colleges do not prefer one test over the other. There may be rumors about some colleges preferring one over the other, but in general, most colleges do not prefer one test over the other. Neither the SAT or ACT is more difficult than the other, although you may get some feedback from students that say otherwise, but from a neutral, objective, quote unquote, standpoint, neither is more difficult than the other. And I think I don't know at SAS if most students take both exams, but I think that may be the case. I'm not sure. But many students take both exams. So test optional and test free. Ms. Hastings will speak more about that in the next slide, but many colleges and universities have released their testing policies for the class of 2024. Others have not, but will do so by late spring, early summer. APs. So I think many of you know that St. Andrews does not offer traditional AP courses. And most selective colleges and universities do not expect our students to take AP exams in order to be competitive applicants. Nonetheless, there's always a nonetheless. Students who take some of our advanced studies courses often are in a position with additional preparation to take these exams, these AP exams, and often do fairly well. The only universities who require AP exams are many international schools. For example, some schools in the UK like Cambridge and Oxford do require AP exams, and I believe some schools in Europe and Canada also. So if you'd like more information about that, please contact Mr. Hansel and Ms. Hastings, who have worked with students who've applied and enrolled in international schools. Just some fun facts. Fun fact, today is the deadline to register for AP exam. If you register after today, it's an additional $40. I believe it's $97 per exam. The number of SAS students who've taken AP exams has declined quite a bit. A lot of it, I would assume, is related to the pandemic and the landscape of testing in general. So for example, in 2018, 102 SAS students sat for an AP exam. In 2019, it was 93. And of course, beginning in 2020, there's a significant drop. So about 47 students in 2020 took or sat for an AP exam. And last year, May of 2022, about 31 students took the AP exams. So I think a good lesson is that most of our students get into great schools without having taken the AP exams. We don't discourage students to take AP exams, but we also don't make them feel like they have to take the AP exams. So in September, a lot of students took the practice ACT. Most fifth form students took the PSAT. December, the ACT and ACT both offered at SAS. The deadlines have passed, but there is a late registration deadline for the SAT, which is November 22nd. In the spring, there's an option to sit for the SAT again in March or May. And or the ACT, April, sometimes June. And the summer, there's also additional opportunities to sit for the SAT, beginning in August and early fall, October, and for the ACT, July or September. I don't know, Jason or Anna, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I would just say, we say this many times, but each student is individual and there's just no one formula. I mean, we share all the information, but I think as we begin these conversations with our students, with your students, we can really hone in and tailor the program to what fits them best. So again, we know some students are going to be done already. Some students, we might decide pretty early on, you know what, you're going to go test optional, and let's not stress about this or make this a big part of the process. So it really will vary. So. Am I test prep guy?
Oh, you are? Okay. I thought it was
Okay,
Anna.
I wasn't sure. So that segues into the test optional piece. And again, I know we talked about this quite a bit, but for those of you who weren't at the program over Parents Weekend, we did discuss this notion that test prep during the course of the school year is very challenging, and some of your students may have been doing this already, and it's a lot. I mean, as we arrive to break this Friday, I can speak, I think, for most of the faculty and all the students that we're all pretty toasted right now. We're all pretty tired and ready for this break. And the schedule at St. Andrews is busy and it's packed, and so trying to fit test prep in is challenging. So we tend to, we'll say proceed with caution if that's something you want to do. Again, talk to us and we can discuss whether it makes sense for your students. And then, a part of that is there are some schools, particularly public universities and University of Florida and Florida State, all the public schools in Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, and then and of the private schools, Georgetown and MIT are the two that do require testing. So if they end up on a student's radar, we'll obviously say, we're going to make sure that they pursue the testing. And then the last group of schools are schools that won't look at scores. I still have no idea how the UC system is able to read applications without testing, but they've been doing it. And then some other schools you can see on that list that are test free, which means they won't even consider the score. So, but again, these are lots of questions where we will work individually with students and families and make sure we figure out what the best plan of attack will be for testing and test prep. So.
All right, this is me. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about financial aid. It's something that I think over the course of the dozen years that I've done this job, I kind of can't emphasize enough how important it is that if financial aid or finances in general are a consideration for your family when it comes to paying for college, which for many of us that's going to be the case as prices climb and I don't know, inflation, all that. But it's really important to kind of start the conversation with your student early. Certainly, I recommend wholeheartedly that it begins this year and that you have a pretty frank discussion about what might be affordable and what might not be. Now, you might be saying to yourself, how do I figure that out? There are net price calculators by law on every college website. If you go to their financial aid website or to their admissions website, you can find them and they can help you do some predicting of approximately what you might be expected to pay at that particular school. I often recommend to families run a calculator at your home public university, run one at a private school that uses something called the CSS profile, which is a very nitty-gritty form, and run one maybe at a private school that doesn't use that only uses the FAFSA, and you can then get often sort of some sense of what you might be expected to pay at different institutions. Something that's really important to note is that St. Andrews tends to be more generous than colleges and universities. We don't get federal funding. We don't have to follow specific rules and guidelines, but the colleges do. And so occasionally parents are taken by surprise at the cost, at what the colleges might be asking them to pay relative to what they're currently paying at St. Andrews. The colleges will also expect students to contribute. They'll usually be asking for about a quarter of whatever assets the student has in their name. So that's good to be aware of. They'll also ask them to contribute via work study, potentially. And of course, the dreaded college loans are often in the student's name. Parents can take them out too, but are often in the student's name. So there are different ways that the schools are going to expect students, again, to contribute to their cost of education. And that's an important conversation too, to have, I think, with your particular student in terms of also what your expectations might be in terms of their contributions. If you are, again, aside from net price calculators, kind of trying to figure some of this out, other things in terms that you might hear to try to find the most affordable schools are schools that meet 100% of demonstrated need. That means that they will not, if it's estimated that you can pay $10,000, that is what they will ask you to pay. And they may use some loan to meet that, but that's how they're going to evaluate you there. So you want to seek out schools that say that. There are also, if you are potentially in that tricky middle spot where you can maybe afford your in-state public, that then means your kid should apply to the in-state public. And maybe then you also want to look for some schools that have some generous merit scholarships. And certainly we've worked with students on that before. And what that also means is it's good to look at those schools, and as you plan visits and your child is doing research, to really explore those options carefully. There are also, finally, sort of two final points about this are related to early financial aid reads, especially at some of the small liberal arts colleges. They're really wonderful. If you reach out to their financial aid offices kind of in advance of early decision deadlines, they will sometimes be willing to evaluate your financial profile before your child applies. Sometimes early decision is something families are nervous about because of finances. And so that's, again, an important thing, I think, that you can do. A college may say no, but they may also say yes. And so it's worth inquiring. And then just the last point is, oftentimes students will come and say, what outside scholarships can I apply to? I'll be really honest, it's very unusual for students to get a hefty outside scholarship. People hear about the Gates Scholarship or the Coca-Cola scholarships, and they think that's going to fund my college education. They're really selective, they're really tough. And so oftentimes the best approach, if money is a consideration, which it is for most of us, is to go for the schools that meet 100% of demonstrated need, or that have a lower sticker price, or where your child might be one of the strongest applicants in the pool and therefore could get some merit money.
All right, well, we want to wrap up and leave some time for questions. So again, this is basically a review of what we've been talking about, but as you think about what we will do with your students over the next 12 months and beyond, I guess, but at least certainly through the end of this year, is help them build these balanced lists. So we use this data we have in SCORE and make sure that their lists make good sense, that they're balanced, that they're going to have great choices when they go through the process. We certainly can help, as we talked about, guide them with testing and when to test and which tests to take. And also, we've all been to visit a lot of these colleges, so we can suggest places to cluster together to visit. And also, if there's students, former SAS students at those places, we can try to connect you with them as well, so you can talk to a former St. Andrews student.
As you can see, there are lots of terms here that are related to advice and guidance. We offer guidance on testing, advice on recommendations, course selection. We give feedback on essays, and we obviously write recommendation letters for each of the students that we work with. I think one of the things that we want to emphasize here is that we give, again, advice and guidance. We can tell students kind of based on our experience and knowledge what we know. We don't do things for the student, and I think that's really important. So sometimes I actually had a student recently say, could you just write that sentence for me? And I said, absolutely not. I will tell you, give you advice on how to do it, but I'm not going to do it for you. And I think that's a really important part of kind of understanding what college counselors do, and then perhaps also what you as caregivers and parents, what your roles are in the process as well.
Yeah, I like to say we're sort of like the coaches on the sideline. We're giving them advice, we're helping them, but unfortunately we can't go in and play the game for them. So that's sort of a similar part of this college process too. So last slide is what you do as the caregivers and supporters of the students is to again, listen to them and let them guide the process, you know, and we know that every student's different. Some students are raring to go and already researching, and some of you have already been on visits with them, and other students are a little more reluctant, but listening to them is really important. And as the second point is staying open-minded to what they have to say.
Great. And if you were here at Parents Weekend, you heard us talk a bit about kind of, it's not about you. It's also not about us. It's about the kid. And so we don't use the we, and we really suggest that you encourage your kids, get them ready that things might not work out their way, which for some students here, it's the first time that they'll have ever heard no. And know that they're going to be okay when they hear no, or if they hear no. And then also, obviously, I think we mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, talk about stuff besides college. It's great to talk about their cross-country race or their art project or their voice lesson. Talk about things other than just what was your last meeting with Dr. Pitts about.
Yeah, I think this is especially true around the holidays when it seems to be like the only questions adults, uncles, aunts, and cousins ask the juniors is like, well, so where do you want to go to college? And so, I think that's a question that probably induces more stress than not. So, trying to limit that a little bit, I think, especially this early in the process would be a good thing too. So, all right, I think that's our last slide. If I'm not, yes. And I will open it up and do one of you want to go through some of the questions?
Yeah, so a couple of them are like overlap. So there's a question about how many schools typically go on a list, like how big the college list is.
I would say I tend to recommend that a final list at the end of things is 8 to 12 schools. Certainly fewer than 8 can definitely be okay and is often okay. I have a student this year with 6, but much more than 12. And it's besides the fact of creating a lot of work, costing a lot of money and taking a lot of time. I think students are usually less able to focus on where they really want to go when they get many more than a dozen.
There are questions about weighted courses. Are our honors courses weighted for purposes of GPA? And does GPA include non-academic classes, and is it weighted for AS classes?
Good question. So St. Andrews does not weight classes, right? So we do share with colleges sort of context. We give something that's called a school profile so they can see that the most rigorous courses are our advanced studies courses and our honors courses, but we don't do the weighting for them. So the colleges will, consider the rigor of the curriculum, but they won't, it's not going to be indicated by the GPA. And that's, again, one of those subtleties is why you'll see one of those graphs and you'll see, boy, there's 5 students. They all look very similar, but these 3 got in, these 2 didn't. And that's the part that you don't see in the graph is what was the rigor of the student's curriculum? What's the student interested in studying at a particular college? What kinds of activities was the student involved with? And so all those other factors, which are sort of non-quantitative, also play a big role at selective schools. So the data is helpful and helps guide us, but it certainly doesn't tell the whole story.
We have a question about students applying early and how that, and then if they withdraw an application, what does that data look like in score? And the answer is, if a student withdraws an application from a college and thus never gets a decision, it doesn't show up anywhere in score. The only data that you will see in those scatter plots on score is related to students who have actually applied and received a decision from an institution.
There's a question about seeing more traction in certain schools as of late for SAS applicants. I know Davidson, et cetera, are a strong match.
I don't think that there's been any particular big shifts. I mean, we definitely have we definitely have a strong reputation, I think, amongst great colleges. You know, when we go out and visit schools and when they visit us and when they go to conferences, I think St. Andrews is a school that is well known as a high quality place and a place that has kids of great character. But I think sometimes it's more indicative of the students' interest. So certain schools become more popular at St. Andrews, and so we have more applicants, and so more kids tend to get in. And yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily say that there's been any shifts in how we're perceived, more what the kids are interested in. So probably the classic example is Brown, which was a place that we just hadn't had a lot of traction, and kids had sort of stopped applying, and now we've had 9 kids go in the last 3 years, and so it's now become back to being really popular. That's one that stands out to us, but otherwise it's a lot of the same schools that continue to be popular remain so, I think, this year in this year's class anyway. So, and there's definitely a bias. I think East Coast down to North Carolina is where a lot of our students cluster. There's a few in the Midwest, but not as many. And again, West Coast, there's always a couple, but I would say that the majority of our kids are still looking sort of from the East Coast down to North Carolina.
There's a question about reach schools. It seems like the hardest thing might be figuring out which one school to apply to early. Do you advise that that's a reach school?
No, not necessarily. I advise if a student wants to apply early decision, that's the application that goes in. And if the student gets in, that's where they're going to college. I advise that it should be a school they really love, and that's a great fit. So that could be a reach school. It could be a likely, quite honestly. I mean, to me, it should always be a school that the student's going to be happy at. I know sometimes people think it should be a reach because that increases your chances of getting in. And at certain places, that's absolutely true. But again, if they would be miserable there, then what's the point? So no.
Do we help with mock interviews? I would say yes.
Yep, I did one today.
For families that have complicated financial situations, what is the best way to get advice?
It's a really good question.
A great question.
I think I would start early, going through, the information that the colleges have, my intuition on the websites, but it is tricky. I think, if you have sort of a family with, 2 incomes and, and you don't have your own business or you don't own a farm and things like that, I think it's pretty straightforward, but it can get complicated. And I would say that we know quite a bit, but we're not experts. And so, it might be helpful to seek out someone who is more of an expert if you've got a really complicated situation. I don't know how you feel, Anna.
Yeah, I also think it's really smart to ask the colleges themselves pretty directly, and know that there are colleges, like a lot of colleges will work with families that have complicated situations. I think certainly if you reach out to us individually, I can tell you in my experience, certain things that have sometimes seemed complicated, but are actually not. Some of it is really, you need to know how the school is going to evaluate certain assets or certain circumstances. Like one thing that sometimes catches parents of St. Andrews students by surprise is that colleges, the vast majority will not account for a younger child in private school, for example. And that's obviously, it can be a big expense, but the colleges see that as a choice. And so then that can impact certainly what you might be asked to pay. That's a less complicated one, but certainly I'd say reach out to us and we can kind of tell you what we know. And then also the colleges themselves are great resources.
There's a really interesting question about race and college admissions. As the Supreme Court will be ruling on considerations in race and college applications soon, are you thinking differently about race in the application / admission? Will the decision affect 2024 students?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was at a national conference where probably just about every college admissions officer was represented from every college you can imagine, along with lots of folks from the high school side. And that was by far the hottest topic. I think everyone is sort of anticipating this potential ruling and yeah, I think we're all sort of like waiting and seeing, but aware that this could impact how colleges make decisions. But right now, I think we're in a wait and see mode. But I'm very aware of it, and it's, again, I think cause of a lot of concern for a lot of folks who work in this business. So I think we have time for maybe these last two questions, and then we probably need to shut it down. So.
Yeah, what percentage of St. Andrews students apply early decision, early action?
Pretty much everyone applies early. So for just clarify, early action is the non-binding. You apply earlier and you find out earlier, but you don't have to go. Early decision is that you apply earlier, find out earlier, and if you get in, you are going. So pretty much all of our seniors submitted an application by the first or second week of November. So everybody, the percentage that applies early decision under that binding is probably about half. Jason, what are our numbers this year? I haven't crunched them this year.
Yep, it's between 50 and 60% will be an early decision of the class. So, but 100% will apply early something. So our work is very front loaded here in the college office. It's September and October are like tax season for us. So.
Yeah.
A last question. Do colleges ever reach out to SAS to ascertain if a student really wants to go there, i.e. figure out where they are on a student's list?
Not that directly, but I think a lot of colleges, not the most selective schools, so sort of not the Harvard, Yale crowd, but there are some schools that do track what we call demonstrated interest. So they'll see if the student has visited, they'll look to see if the student met a representative when they visited St. Andrews. Some schools even will track how often you open their emails. So there are some schools that will track that to ascertain, like, what's the likelihood this student will come here. So we do inform students about this and say, like, it's really important, especially for those likely schools, that you let them know that you are genuinely interested in them, because those are the schools that tend to track that, not as much as the highly selectives. So, well, we really appreciate you being here with us tonight. These were great questions. And obviously, I hope you can tell how excited we are to work with the students. I had my first junior meeting today, I had 2 today, and they were amazing. And I have a couple more this week, and we'll hit them. We'll be full force when we come back from Thanksgiving break to meet with the students, and look forward to working with you as well. So as questions arise, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You know, obviously you have an assigned counselor, but we're always all available for you if things come up. And, you know, as you come to campus throughout the year, we're happy to connect in person too. So, hope everyone has a great night. It's cold and rainy here, so I'm excited to get home and out of the rain in a few minutes, and wish you all the best and have a great Thanksgiving.
Take care. Thanks, everyone.